Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning. Today, my guest is Damien Fox, who's an attorney in Toronto, Canada. He's the in-house counsel for Phoenix Geophysics, which is a geophysics instrument, in, manufactures geophysical instruments for resource exploration around the world. His job is not only as an attorney, but he has to do a lot of traveling in connection with that job. Damien's been taking Alexander lessons for at least 12 years, I believe with four different teachers, one of them being myself. And we're going to just talk today a little bit about how he came to the Alexander technique and what his experiences have been with it. Damien, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good morning, Robert. Or good afternoon, I guess, depending on which time
it's afternoon for you, and it's still morning for me.
Yeah.
Before we begin our conversation, what would you say to someone if you were on an elevator and they asked you what the Alexander technique is, and you've got 20 seconds to answer?
The hard questions right up front.
Right up, yeah.
Well, that's always tough because you have to know who you're talking to. But just as a sort of a generic response, I'd say, the Alexander technique to me has been an incredibly valuable tool to take control of myself. And that's not just the mind or not just the body, but as a whole self, and bringing all the different parts together and realizing it's not the back, it's my back. And it's under my control to some extent, right? Usually if I let go, it's mine.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. So how did you get interested in the technique in the beginning?
Well, absolute desperation. I was walking along the street and I saw a poster from not yours. It was
I know the one you mean, though. Yeah.
But I saw that poster and it said "Head up, eyes forward," and I thought, wow, that's kind of an interesting thought. And it made me think back to a scene in a movie where Peter O'Toole's on a bicycle teaching someone how to ride a bike, and he said, "Head up, eyes forward, back straight," and anyway, it all kind of came to me in a second, and I just sort of tried it. I said, well, head up and eyes forward. And I realized my head had been down and my eyes had been down, and it felt a bit better. And I didn't think too much about it, but I tried it again a few minutes later on the subway. And then I thought, well, maybe there is something to this. But I hadn't taken one of the pieces from the poster, so I looked Alexander technique up online, and I found you, actually. So then we met when you came to Toronto one day.
Yeah, and that was, I guess, about 12 years ago.
Maybe 2004, 2005. Yeah.
Somewhere in that period. And I know you had a bunch of lessons with me then, and I know you also had you moved to Ottawa for a while, right?
Yeah, when I was in Ottawa, I had an instructor.
You had lessons there, and then you've had lessons with another teacher in Toronto, and then
awesome.
Yeah. So, what were your experiences with it? Starting early on. What did you notice at the beginning, and I assume it must have been something interesting or good enough to keep you continuing.
Yeah, well, law school is not an easy process, and lawyers and people working in offices overall tend to spend a lot of time sitting and a lot of stress and a lot of just deep concentration, where people certainly I lose track of what else is going on as I'm deep in reading a document and trying to see how to reply to an email. So that kind of distraction really, I found it really wore on me a lot. And it led to kind of a difficult position where I had a lot of pain and a lot of distraction from that pain. And it was astounding, all the things I tried, a different computer mouse, a different chair, exercises, physiotherapy, whatever it is, needles in the back, all these things have definitely, a chiropractor, all these things had some influence. So I wouldn't discount them at all. And there's definitely merit to a lot of them. But I found, at least for me, even a few Alexander lessons were just a transformative experience, where it went from, wow, there's so much pain I can't sit in this chair, to could have, I think it was, you said, well, who told you can't sit in this chair? And I realized it was myself. And getting out of my own way actually was probably the most effective treatment of all. And it didn't involve any drugs or needles or special exercises and so on. And it's not instant gratification, though there is a little bit of that during a lesson. But with time, there's definitely that release and that gratification, which can be luring. You got to be careful, right? It's an easy thing to chase.
Right.
It's a hard thing to catch.
Could you say a little more about that last sentence of yours?
Oh yeah, well the sort of the end gaining versus the means whereby is always a trick. I mean,
we should maybe explain what those terms mean.
I don't know if I'm the best person.
I'll explain them, and then you say what your experience around them was.
Go ahead.
So end gaining is a bit of a bit of Alexander jargon, but it really just means that people tend to want to, when they want something, like say the phone rings and you want to answer the phone. That's all you want to do is get up and answer the phone. You're not usually paying a lot of attention to you as you're getting up and walking over to the phone and picking up the phone. You just want to get the phone answered, whereas means whereby, another bit of jargon, is what is the process you use with yourself to get up and walk over and pick up the phone. Okay. How are you using your body to do that? So to get back to what you were saying, it sounds like you might have got caught up in end gaining a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's not unnatural, and it's quite common. I mean, you see a lot of people, especially in the legal industry or the computers field, like computer programmers. There's a lot of people that spend a lot of time striving towards either winning the case or finishing a document or finishing the code, getting it perfected. That could be at 2:00 in the morning. There's that drive of putting in the time and the intense focus, often to the exclusion of other things, especially something as less important as one's back, for example. Sure, it hurts, but I can sit in this new chair and do 4 hours instead of 2 and get it done. So that kind of drive can lead to, I'd call it a defect of planning, where the one account of the sort of the mind-body interface and the mind and their body, I mean, gets drained to the, that side gets neglected, where it all gets spent on the other side, which could lead to some achievement. Sure, yeah, you got the A in that class, or you finished that brief, or whatever it is. But first, that's not a good thing, and to lose one side completely. And second, it's not necessary. That's actually the crazy thing. It's more about doing it the right way rather than the wrong way. Kind of like being stuck in the snow with a car. I mean, you could spin your wheels a lot and get nothing done. But there are ways to get out, as people have learned in Canada, right?
We're experts at it. But so that just means, so another way of saying that is you learn the skill of doing something in a more efficient, easy manner. And you're still going to get it done, and you're probably going to get it done better and faster.
I don't have to get into pain just because I'm concentrating on some other work. It's easy to slip into a mode which is causing that pain. Probably right now I'm not sitting in a very neutral, low energy way, though I could be if I put more attention to it. But I'm certainly sitting in a easier, lower energy way than the first time I walked into one of your classes.
Right. Well, wouldn't you say that from your experience, maybe one of the, quote, problems, unquote, of end gaining is that it does work? You get the thing done.
Yeah, you can.
So you could have this idea that it's been successful, and in one sense maybe it has, but if it's at a cost to your own body that's going to linger on, then that's a whole nother question, and that's really what we're talking about here.
That discussion is often not even a discussion that's allowed openly, because then the assumption is that, well, then you're not going to achieve because you need to neglect the actual work to do something else, right? There's,
Mm-hmm.
unless you only have so much to spend, you either spend it here or spend it there. And if you're going to spend it on yourself or just not do the job, then, well, that's not something people want to talk about too much.
Right.
But again, I think there's an alternative to those two where you can do the job in a different way and
Mm-hmm.
still put the energy towards that. But, maybe it's actually, we talk about energy a lot in lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, maybe actually, I think I'm just kind of realizing now, maybe I've been burning a lot of energy doing the wrong thing physically while doing the right stuff for work. And it's completely not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of, anyway, I mean, it gets complicated and metaphysical, and you're the teacher, not me. I know I feel better overall, and it takes effort on my part, but it's pretty easy effort as effort goes.
It's more like a very gentle bit of mental effort, if you want to call it effort, or mental direction, really.
Yeah, it's not
It
straight.
doesn't, not effort as in heavy lifting kind of effort. And
No.
I think to get back to what you were saying about end gaining, and there's certain occupations that seem to encourage, in my experience, that seem to encourage end gaining. The legal profession being one,
Oh yeah,
as I'm sure you've seen. And there's certain other professions, for example, dance or some athletics, professional athletics,
yeah,
where there's just huge emphasis on just doing it. And if you're in pain, you just, you work through the pain.
yeah,
And of course, there's a price to be paid, and it's paid by the dancer or by the attorney or by the athlete.
yeah.
And you sort of see the results of that all over the place.
Yeah, well, I'm no athlete or dancer, but I worked at a clinic in San Francisco that
Mm-hmm.
was focused on technology, various forms of technology and intellectual property law.
Mm-hmm.
And a good chunk of that office was sitting on those big rubber balls and wearing splints, and you could see them in meetings all straining their backs and so on.
Yeah,
And it's the kind of the combination of the computer guys and the law people all together, and it's yeah, there are parts of the world where that's endemic, right?
right. So, just for someone listening to our conversation at this point, is there any way you could describe a little bit about how you use the technique? If you notice, for example, as you mentioned earlier, well, maybe I'm not sitting as well as I might. Um, to kind of give our listeners some idea of what it is that Alexander teachers actually teach Alexander students.
Okay, well, just as we were speaking, after making that comment, I realized, well, hold on a second. There's something I can do about this. Now we have the luxury of being over the telephone only. We're using Skype, but there's no video feed, right?
Right.
So first off, that let me slouch if I felt like in my office chair for a while at lunchtime, sure, but because I'm not on stage being seen. But
Right.
that wasn't helpful to anybody. It didn't make me feel any better. So I just sort of set about rearranging myself briefly. I stood up and then sat back down in the chair, and that was a little bit of a reset. Where instead of perpetuating a habit I'd been doing, I actually let myself just sort of be and putting a bit of attention towards my back and my hands and my neck, and a lot of the somewhat of the some of the negative direction, where
Mm-hmm.
there's the internal message of there's no need to do this or no need to do that.
Or
And that
even,
was,
or even, I'm not sitting.
yeah, that
Yeah.
was actually a possibility. There was no need for me to be sitting there. I was allowed to get up and stand for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And that in itself can kind of be a liberating thought,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And even as you're sitting right now, you could
Yeah.
say, I'm not sitting, and that might shift a little bit the way in which you sit.
Yeah, I just tried it a bit, and
Yeah.
my head is up a little bit more than it
Mm-hmm.
was. So
Right. Without you making that happen.
yeah,
And I think that's the key here.
it's like a spring. You let
Yeah.
go of it, it springs. You don't
Right.
pull the spring back open again. It just sort of goes on its own. So um, it might it probably feels less natural,
Mm-hmm.
at
Less,
first.
yeah.
There's a lot that feedback is very, very unreliable.
Right, right.
I think back to my first lesson with you so long ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I thought I was going to fall over. We were
Yeah.
standing, and I thought I was going to fall over.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was telling me I was going to fall over, except,
That you didn't.
yeah, you asked me, are you? And I said, well, no. So, except for the one piece of real evidence that I wasn't, everything else was screaming that I was. And that made me laugh out loud.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I remember that in many of those sessions, especially the earlier days. It was just such a startling change of worldview about how things work and how they can work. Yeah, and I still get that once in a while. I think
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
our last session in Toronto, I chuckle like, what am I thinking, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, just to elaborate on what you were saying earlier, I mean, one way to describe what you learn in Alexander lessons is you learn how to, in a sense, direct yourself out of habitual tension patterns.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. And the benefits are obviously enormous, although they're not always immediately noticeable in full force. But I assume that from what you said that it didn't take you very long, maybe one or two lessons, before you could sense some value in the work.
Oh,
Right?
it was almost immediate during
Yeah.
the first lesson.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
which, I mean, the first session of chiropractic work can be very effective too.
sure,
But
absolutely.
it's often something that wears off very quickly, and the only way to get more of it is to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the Alexander technique work, definitely there's work with an instructor, but just like with taking piano lessons as a kid, there's a lot to be done on my own, and I could access quite a bit of that relief or change in my feeling, pain reduction on my own later on, like back when you're when you're back in the States and I'm here, for example, or if it's Sunday afternoon, not a day of a lesson, I could work on it myself,
Right,
not just to get better, but to actually make use of the you could call them tricks, but techniques, the actual tools.
Tools, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would want to say to someone who hasn't had lessons and might be a bit intrigued by our conversation?
Yeah, it's tough because there's very little language in sort of modern English that we use that can describe this type of work or how this type of technique operates without sort of almost dipping into metaphysical. It's almost like it's that discussion has been hijacked by kind of other things, and it's very difficult to talk about it without sounding weird, right? Like maybe you don't feel that way, but I know, like in my experience, it's been tough. What is it, right? Well, just that discussion is often a very difficult one.
And yet, and I agree with you 100%. And yet, the technique is incredibly grounded in day-to-day
Oh yeah,
reality.
But if I told somebody I'm taking this anti-inflammatory, it makes my back feel better, they'd nod and say yes, even though they know nothing about medicine or chemistry.
Right, but
Okay,
if you tell them I'm learning how to think in a way that will release tensions in my body,
right?
Boy, that
Or
sounds
if
a
I
little
took
weird, right?
a muscle relaxant that it
Yeah.
has a very strong mental effect too. If you've ever taken a powerful muscle
Sure,
relaxant,
yeah,
they'd nod their head and say, "Oh yeah, of course." And again, they know nothing about chemistry or medicine, so there's this bias again in our culture and language that makes it difficult to discuss this. But people shouldn't let that scare them off. It's a different way of thinking, but there's a reason why it's helpful because that's partly because it's different. And whatever it is you've been doing, if it's not working for you, maybe you should look at doing something a bit different. And sometimes that involves trying something that is a little outside somebody's comfort zone in terms of behavior, whatever it is.
yeah.
But anyway, that's
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end our conversation. What do you think?
Well, yeah.
I'll
Talking to you, but
so I just want to say my guest today once again has been Damien Fox, who is an attorney who lives in Toronto, Canada. He's had Alexander lessons with a number of teachers, including me, over the last 10 to 12 years. Damien, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Good talking to you, and